This is Kim, and this is video 3 on the animals. And in this video, I'm talking about the chordates, which includes the vertebrates, which includes us. First, though, I want to go back to something I ended with in video number 2. We were talking about the difference between protostomes and deuterostomes. And remember, I used a couple of terms such as blastopore. I want to just remind you that egg and sperm come together through fertilization to form that first cell called the zygote. And that zygote then divides in a very specific pattern that is unique in protostomes and deuterostomes. Different pattern of cell division at the beginning. It's really mitosis, but early in development, we call that division cleavage because it has a very specific pattern. Also, we talked about the blastopore. A blastula is this hollow ball of cells that forms in embryonic development in animals. And that hollow ball of cells then at some point starts to indent and become what's called the gastrula. And that indentation is called gastrulation. That indent becomes the gut cavity of the animal. And that first opening becomes the mouth in protostomes, and it becomes the anus in deuterostomes. We are a deuterostome. Here's another picture of that. So in protostomes, that blastopore, that initial opening becomes the mouth. So that would be in annelids, mollusks, and arthropods. Then in deuterostomes, which is echinoderms and chordates, it becomes the anus. So phylum Chordata has some characteristics that unite the phylum, even though there are two subphyla that seem pretty different from us. The 4 chordate characteristics are notochord, which is seen here in red. It's this red rod running down the back of this animal. That's the notochord. A dorsal nerve cord, and you see that running down the back of the animal in blue. The pharynx with gill slits. They're called pharyngeal gill slits on this list. And then a postanal tail. Postanal means behind the anus, and here's that tail. So even these really primitive chordates, the Urochordata and the Cephalochordata, which are actually invertebrates, have those characteristics at some point in their life. So here are the 3 subphyla of Urochordata. I'm sorry, of Chordata. The subphyla of Chordata, starting with Urochordata and including Cephalochordata. Those are the non-vertebrates. They also called invertebrates. I'm not sure why they wrote non-vertebrates here. And then the vertebrata, which includes us. So this is the vertebrates. I want to start with Urochordata. These are some weird animals. They can be called sea squirts or tunicates. They're called tunicates because they secrete this tunic around the adult body. It's actually made of cellulose. It's pretty crazy. But in these animals, the adults only retain one chordate characteristic, the pharynx. Otherwise, the larvae have the other chordate characteristics, a dorsal nerve cord, a pharynx, a notochord, and right here is the postanal tail. The larvae are free swimming. The adults are sessile, which means they don't move. And again, very primitive chordates. The other group, which you will see if you go on to take a higher level majors biology class, the Amphioxus, is in subphylum Cephalochordata. They're also called lancelets. These look like little fish, but they don't have a vertebral column or a skull like fish would. They don't really have a distinguishable head. They spend most of their time partially buried, and they filter feed. So their head is sticking up and they're going to filter feed. They do have all the chordate characteristics. So here's Amphioxus. You can see he has a postanal tail. He has a notochord, a dorsal nerve cord, and he has a pharynx with gill slits. And then finally, we get to the vertebrates. The vertebrates are unique in that they have a vertebral column that encloses the dorsal nerve cord. So our spinal cord is enclosed in our vertebral column. They also have the brain encased in the skull. And the head is really where all of the sensory information is processed. So this shows vertebral column surrounding that dorsal nerve cord. I'm going to start with the most primitive vertebrates, and actually there's some controversy right now as to whether or not these first guys should even be classified as vertebrates. So this first one is a hagfish. Hagfish do not have jaws. I'm going to write that on here. It's going to be messy, but no jaws. And the reason a lot of scientists are now saying maybe they shouldn't really be classified as vertebrates is because they really don't have vertebrae and they have a very poorly developed skull. They produce slime and they're all marine. They feed on invertebrates and dead fish. They have 4 rows of teeth where they can bore into a fish and eat a dead or dying fish. But due to the fact that they don't have any vertebrae and they have a very poorly developed skull, some are saying they shouldn't be classified as vertebrates. They used to be in the vertebrate class Agnatha. A means without and Natha means jaws. So they used to be in the class that means no jaws. And they were called the jawless fish. So we're going to still consider them really primitive vertebrates. Another primitive jawless vertebrate are the lampreys. And they also used to be classified as Agnatha because they don't have jaws either. The lampreys, though, do have a skull and do have vertebrae. They are parasites, and you can see that scary mouth where they attach to the side of a fish by suction, and those tooth-like plates burrow in. They have a rasping tongue that can help open the side of the fish, and they suck on the blood of the fish. So these also used to be Agnatha, and that classification has changed slightly, but we'll still refer to these as the jawless fish. Okay, there's only so big you can get if you don't have jaws. These guys also don't have scales and they don't have fins. Okay, so no jaws, obviously, but they also don't have any fins. So it's pretty hard to move efficiently if you don't have fins. Sorry, I don't have my Apple Pencil right now, so I'm going to do my best with the mouse. So really the most primitive vertebrates that are true vertebrates are the class chondrichthyes. So chondro, this means cartilage, and ichthyes means fish. These are the cartilage fish. It includes the rays, the skates, and the sharks. What were the advancements in this group? Well, you can see right away, Jaws. I think that was a movie. These are the first with jaws. And they also have paired fins, which means they can move very efficiently, not as efficiently as the bony fish that we'll see in a little while, but more efficiently than a lamprey or a hagfish for sure. If you have jaws, you can be a predator, which means you can get larger. So being able to move with these paired fins is going to make them a good predator. And also having jaws is going to make them a good predator. And both of these things allow these animals to get bigger. Okay, there's only so big a lamprey or a hagfish can get because they can't eat bigger food. They can't be effective predators. So they can't get as large as these do. They're called the cartilage fish because they don't have any bone. Their skull and vertebral column are made of cartilage. Believe it or not, though, they were around at the same time as the bony fish. The bony fish didn't come after the cartilage fish. It's just a different approach. Okay, it's just a different kind of skeleton in the cartilage fish. One thing that's interesting about these guys is they don't have a swim bladder. So they can't be buoyant in the water column. And so when they're not swimming, they sink to the bottom. You'll see in a minute that the swim bladder in the bony fish is what's going to keep them floating in the water column. If you don't have a swim bladder and you're going to sink to the bottom when you're not swimming, you need an asymmetrical tail. Look at this tail. It's bigger on the top than it is on the bottom. This should remind you very much of the tail on an airplane. It produces lift. So when this animal moves its tail side to side, the asymmetrical shape of this tail is going to cause this animal to be lifted off from the bottom of the ocean. You'll also notice this guy has really wide-based attachment for his fins. So the fins don't rotate. So while they have paired fins, no rotation of the fins because they have this wide-based attachment. So they can't really be as agile. If you've ever gone to SeaWorld or some other aquarium where you see sharks swimming, you can see that they'll swim right up to the glass and then they have to quickly jerk their whole body sideways to turn. You'll also see that in the shark videos on Discovery Channel where they're attacking their prey and they come right up to it and then they have to make a sharp turn to move away from whatever they're going for. So they're not really as agile as the bony fish are for that reason. But I think sharks are pretty incredible. Here's the development of jaws. It actually happened from gill arches that move forward. So you can see in this jawless fish at the top, there are these gill arches. And as those move forward, we start getting more development of jaws. Here's another picture of that. The gill arches moving forward to develop the jaws. Here's that asymmetrical tail. It's called heterocercal. Hetero means different. It's two different sizes and shapes, the top versus the bottom. So it provides lift for the fish that don't have an air bladder. But again, they do have reduced maneuverability. This is just a picture of a shark egg, baby shark developing inside there. That's pretty crazy. Sharks, if you've ever touched one, they're pretty sharp. And that's because they have these remnants of the dermal armor that the prehistoric fish had, which is pretty crazy. That's under the microscope. So sharks are pretty cool. Please don't eat sharks. They're becoming less and less abundant in our oceans. They're very overfished. People hunt them and kill them for no good reason. So please don't eat them. Eat sustainable fish. Okay, the next class are the bony fish. Osteo means bone. So osteichthyes, this means bony fish. They evolved about the same time as sharks, about 400 million years ago, but they adopted a heavy internal skeleton made of bone. So this is the first animal we're looking at that has true bone. So the jawless fish didn't have it and the sharks didn't have it. They are the most abundant number of species of all the vertebrates. So the most species-rich group of all vertebrates are the bony fish. Over 30,000 living species. What were the advancements? A swim bladder to help them be buoyant in the water column. A symmetrical tail along with point attachment of fins, and these fins can rotate. So these guys are very agile. If you've ever had the pleasure of going to an aquarium or snorkeling, and you can watch these fish in a coral reef and how they can turn sideways and get into tiny little cracks, and the fins are all really specialized for their lifestyle. They also have a gill covering that they can move to bring water across their gills. So they can actually be more active because they can meet the higher oxygen demand of being active because of that gill covering. So this is the air bladder. It can release gas or fill with gas to change where the fish is in the water column. If you bring that fish up to the surface too quickly from a pretty deep depth, you've probably seen how that swim bladder just pushes all of its organs out through its mouth because you're not giving that swim bladder time to slowly release that gas. This next one shows you their tail. You can see that it is symmetrical. Another term for the tail is the caudal fin. Caudal means tail. Oops, sorry, I thought I had my highlighter there. The caudal fin is another name for the tail. Dorsal means back, so that's the dorsal fin. Here's that gill covering, the operculum. Pectoral fins, pelvic fin, anal fin. These fins, again, can rotate. They have this point attachment of the fins. Very narrow attachment, very agile. There are actually two major groups of the bony fishes, what are called the ray-finned fishes, which you just saw here. You can see the rays in these fins. And then there are lobe-finned fishes. The major difference is there are no muscles within the fins of the ray-finned fishes, but the lobe-finned fishes actually have bones and muscles in their fins. Some of them even kind of walk. I'm doing the little quotes, the air quotes right now that you can't see. They actually walk on the bottom of the ocean with these bone-supported fins. So those are most likely the amphibian ancestors, those lobe-finned fishes. You can see here muscle and bone supporting that fin. That's pretty crazy. Okay, versus just a fin used for swimming, no walking. Not all lobe-finned fishes actually walk on the bottom, just some do. In fact, that one right there is called the coelacanth, and I'll show you him in a minute. But I just want to show you some of the diversity in the bony fish. So beautiful. So many different shapes of their bodies and their fins based on their lifestyle. Lionfish, seahorse, sea dragon. These guys are amazing. Here's the coelacanth. These are very, very primitive fish. They were thought to be extinct. And then in the 1930s, a fisherman in Africa saw this come in on a fishing boat. And that's when we found out that they weren't actually extinct. They walk on the bottom with 4 limbs, very much like an amphibian would. They live up to 2,300 feet in depth. So very, very deep water. They can get really big. And they almost move like a trotting horse, which is pretty crazy. Okay, the next group we have are the amphibians. And these were the first vertebrates to come onto land. They are the direct descendants of fish. Fish like the coelacanth. Think about this. You're an aquatic organism. And suddenly you're going to come onto land. There are going to be some major challenges that you're going to face. The amphibians tried to solve these problems, but didn't perfectly do it. The reptiles did a much better job than the amphibians. The amphibians are still very tied to the water. This includes the frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, and the legless amphibians called the caecilians. I thought I had a picture of those guys here. Here we go. So here are the legless. Apoda means no feet. This guy is beautiful. They're all beautiful. Look at this salamander. And here, of course, is a frog. Here are some pictures of early amphibians, and you can see the similarity in bone structure between this lobe-finned fish with the bony and muscular support, and that just really became even more developed. So you can look at the pelvis and you can look at the tibia, the femur, and the fibula and see how those all relate and how that developed in those early amphibians. We do have fossils of these. I'm going to skip those slides though with the details about those. Okay, so let's look at the challenges that these amphibians faced on land. And there are actually more than this, but this is kind of the short list. Support and movement. Obviously, moving on land under the pressure of gravity is very different from swimming in water. You're going to need legs, and you're going to need vertebral changes to support those legs. And I'm going to show you those on a picture in a minute. Respiration, breathing on land, very different from breathing in the water, where oxygen just moves across your gills versus having to actively take in that oxygen from the atmosphere. Desiccation means drying out. If you're bathed in water, it's very different from being on land where water is not as plentiful. Reproduction. If you're in the water, you can just release eggs and sperm, and those will swim together, move together. Sperm will swim to the egg, and fertilization will just happen. That's going to be much tougher to do on land. Also, you need to have a way to protect your egg from drying out. Vision and hearing, very different on land than in the water. If you've ever opened your eyes underwater or tried to hear underwater, you know that it's very different. And then temperature change. Water is a pretty constant environment in terms of temperature. Very little change from day to night and season to season. The move onto land had very dramatic temperature changes from day to night and season to season. So these are the challenges the amphibians had to deal with. They solved some of these problems, but not completely. So let's start with support and movement. So this is the skeleton of a fish. It's very basic. There's this caudal fin, also known as the tail, and then the vertebral column is pretty similar all the way down. Okay, they can't move their head side to side, no reason to, right? You're in water, you can just shift your body side to side, look left or right. You can just move your whole body. You don't have a real rib cage. You have some rib processes here, vertebral processes, but really the whole skeleton is pretty similar to each other. All the vertebrae are similar to each other, I should say. As amphibians moved on to land, locomotion and support. For the first time, we have a pelvis and shoulder blades, the scapula. Why? Because they needed to support legs. So legs are going to help this organism walk on land versus swimming. And then those legs are going to need support. So for the first time, there's this well-developed scapula and there's a pelvis. Also, you see differentiation in this vertebral column. You see the start of some neck vertebrae here, some cervical vertebrae, although they can't rotate their head. There's this one cervical vertebrae holding the head up that's a little bit different than the others. Oops, I didn't really mean to draw on this second one. But you can see this first one actually doesn't have ribs, the one that's now highlighted yellow. It's holding the head up and it doesn't have rib processes there. It doesn't have vertebral processes. You see thoracic vertebrae here, and then you see caudal vertebrae. So we're starting to get a little bit of differentiation of the vertebral column. You'll see on the lizard coming up that the reptiles really do a very good job with this. So legs, changes to the vertebral column, the addition of some other bones to support walking on land. Those were all necessary. Obviously, the frog skeleton looks really different than this is a salamander. You've all seen frogs jump, and they have hind legs that look really different from this. Okay, so that's how they solved supported movement. Respiration. How did they solve the respiration problem? Well, amphibians are the first with lungs on land. There are some lungfish that have some primitive lungs, but these are full-blown lungs. Some retain gills, but most amphibians have some type of lungs. They don't breathe very efficiently though. They use muscles in their throat to bring air in, not very efficient. So they can't get very big because pretty large oxygen demand. Also, connected with respiration, you have to be able to move those gases around through your body. You need to get oxygen to your tissues, and they have a pretty different heart than birds, mammals, and reptiles do. They have what's called a 3-chambered heart. Now, that was an upgrade from the heart of the fish, but I'll show you that heart in a few minutes so you can see how that works. Circulation and respiration are very closely tied together because the circulatory system is what's going to move that oxygen to the tissues. Drying out, amphibians have not done a very good job of this. The skin must stay moist or it will dry out. So they're very tied to the water for this, or they can use waxes. Lots of frogs spread waxes onto their skin to keep them from drying out. But the eggs are jelly-like, so the eggs can definitely dry out, and they really must be laid in the water. So they're really tied to the water. Toads can live underground, so they can behaviorally prevent drying out. But frogs, salamanders, caecilians, really tied to the water. They have to keep their skin moist. And obviously the juveniles, the tadpoles, if you think about it, they're 100% reliant on the water. So that leads us to reproduction. They must lay eggs in the water or have some other strategy, such as laying them on the back of the other frogs. So sometimes the female lays the eggs on the back of the male and they get covered with skin. Sometimes the male pushes the fertilized eggs up onto the back of the female and they get covered in skin. There are frogs that actually swallow their eggs and they keep them in a pouch in their throat and they develop in the throat, but they must all hatch out over the water. So they haven't really solved this problem. They're still really tied to the water on this one too, on reproduction. Vision and hearing. For the first time, we have animals that can see color. On land, you have a lot more color that you need to see than in the water. So color vision was an advancement in the amphibians. Not as clear though as the reptile color vision. Hearing, for the first time, we have the start of an eardrum and some other structures to be able to sense vibration on land. So this was an advancement for hearing on land in the amphibians. Temperature change, they didn't really solve this very well. Amphibians really can't be active in the winter. Okay, you don't see frogs in the snow, right? Frogs are active at night when it's cooler and moister because they don't want to dry out. But also, speaking of which, obviously you know that frogs must be able to hear pretty well because they have those extreme vocalizations. They call to each other. They wouldn't be calling to each other if they didn't have really good hearing. I love the sound of frogs at night. It's so amazing. But temperature change, they didn't do such a great job with that. They're really only able to be active certain seasons of the year. They have to hibernate or they lay their eggs and the eggs don't hatch out until it's warmer. So those were some of the challenges that amphibians faced on land and some of the ways that they tried to solve those. The reptiles are going to be the ones who really solve the problem. I wanted to show you these frog eggs on the back. It's pretty crazy. Those babies are going to hatch out and the tadpoles burrow out. Here's a beautiful frog. And then, of course, the salamanders and the legless caecilians. Okay, class Reptilia, the reptiles. They dominated the earth for 250 million years, so they were doing something right. There are over 7,000 living species still, and they really solved the problems of living on land. So going back to our original list of problems on land, let's start with locomotion and support. let's go to the vertebral column of the reptiles to show you how they did this. So now we're going to get even more differentiation of the vertebral column in the reptiles. So this is a lizard, and you see even more vertebrae here. You see real defined cervical vertebrae in the neck, more than one. So now they can move their head side to side. You see a well-developed rib cage on these trunk vertebrae. This rib cage is going to have muscles attached, and that's actually going to help them solve the respiration problem as well. So for respiration, rather than just flexing muscles in their throat, they're now going to use rib cage muscles to bring in more oxygen. They don't have a diaphragm like mammals do, but they are able to contract those rib muscles and really bring in a lot more oxygen, which means they can get bigger and they can be more active, because they can bring in the oxygen that higher level of activity requires. You can see sacral vertebrae for the first time over the pelvis. So now we have this well-fused pelvis really supporting these legs. The legs can move up under the body a little bit more rather than being completely splayed out to the side. Well-developed scapula to support the front legs. So those are the vertebral changes that occurred to offer more support and better locomotion on land. Okay, the next problem, respiration, I just talked about briefly. So bringing in more oxygen with those rib cage muscles. Drying out. Reptiles have scales and watertight skin that keeps them from drying out on land. And they also have a watertight egg. It's called the amniote egg. The amniote egg, also called the amniotic egg, was a huge advancement in animals. So now this can be laid on land without drying out. Reptiles, birds, and mammals are all considered amniotes. So some primitive mammals still lay eggs, such as the echidna and the platypus, and we'll talk about that when we get to mammals. Birds, of course, lay eggs. Most biologists consider birds to be reptiles, but we're going to talk about them as a separate group. But the amniotic egg has chambers that really we see in the placenta of mammals as well. So this egg was a big advancement. So really that's kind of two things together. It's the desiccation problem. So the skin of the reptile is not going to dry out due to the scales and the watertight skin, but the egg is not going to dry out either. Remember, the amphibians had the jelly coat egg. Now we have a hard-shelled egg. If you have a hard-shelled egg, you have to have internal fertilization. So this is the first time that animals are going to have internal fertilization, which means male genitalia to carry out that internal fertilization. In fact, some snakes have two penises. And if you have a snake, you might have seen that before. Sorry, I'm trying to write internal fertilization with my mouse. I really wish I could just type on this slide, but it's not letting me. Okay, internal fertilization for the first time. Because it's a hard-shelled egg, it has to get fertilized before it's laid. Okay, same for birds. Other problems living on land, going back to our list. So we just talked about really reproduction and desiccation kind of together. Vision and hearing are also improved in reptiles. Reptiles can see more colors and have better hearing. Temperature change. Reptiles have behavioral mechanisms for regulating their body temperature. Both amphibians and reptiles are what are called ectotherms, meaning that they can't internally regulate their body temperature. They really are the same temperature as their environment. So they have to behaviorally modify their body temperature. And you've all seen this. Reptiles out in the sun, they can't be active when their body isn't up to a certain temperature. So in theory, you could walk up to a cold rattlesnake and pick it up and it couldn't do anything to you. I wouldn't recommend it. But that's why they come out in the morning and they lay in the sun until they can get enough heat that their enzymes start working, their muscles start working, and they can be active. Because they are ectotherms, meaning their temperature is the same as the outside, unless they do something to behaviorally change that. Their heart is more advanced. And now I'm going to show you a picture of the reptile heart. So here you see on the right is the fish. Atrium and ventricle, not really separated, pretty primitive heart. The reptiles have an almost full division of the heart into 4 chambers. It's what's called a 3.5 chamber heart. What this means is you can pump with more force out to the body than you can to the lungs. Let's think about this. Fish don't have that separation. So when the heart contracts, when that heart muscle contracts, it's sending blood out to the body at the same force as it is to the gills. If there's too much force, it's going to blow out those gill capillaries. In amphibians, they don't have this separation. So when this heart muscle contracts, again, the heart is sending blood to the little tiny capillaries of the lungs at the same pressure as it is out to the body. You can't blow out the lungs, so what that means is the body can only get so big. Otherwise, the blood isn't going to get throughout all of the tissues. There's not enough pressure. There's not enough force of that blood coming out. So now in reptiles, with this slight division here, it means they can pump to the lungs at a lower pressure than to the body. So you can see when this heart contracts, this blood is going to the lung capillaries, okay? And then this blood is going out to the body. And it can do that at 2 different forces. You're going to see in mammals and birds, this is completely divided. So now there can really be a difference in pressure. Think about this. I mean, your lungs are right next to your heart. You don't need much pressure to get the blood to your lungs, but you definitely need a lot of pressure to get it to your entire head and body. So that's how the reptiles have really taken off to be so successful on land. This really talks about being an ectotherm. So reptiles are ectothermic. They have to obtain heat from external sources, and they regulate their body temperature by moving in and out of the sun. Okay, compare that to endothermic animals that generate their own heat internally. That is mammals and birds. So birds are the first endotherms. They can physiologically thermoregulate. That's a huge energy requirement. So most of the food we eat as mammals is to keep us warm. We produce metabolic heat as we break down our food, and that keeps us at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's a cost associated with being able to physiologically thermoregulate, right? So you have to eat more food, but what it means is if you're endothermic, it means you can be active day and night, and you can be active season to season, and you can be living in different types of environments. You don't see reptiles in the winter in the snow, but you see lots of mammals in the winter in the snow. You also see lots of birds. So if you can physiologically thermoregulate, it means you need a lot more food intake, but you can produce your own heat. So that's going to be an advancement coming up in the birds. So birds are considered to be reptiles, but they do have some features that are very different from reptiles, and endothermy is one of them. Okay, there are 4 surviving orders of reptiles. So living reptiles includes the turtles and tortoises, a very rare group called the tuatras. Lizards and snakes are grouped together. So snakes are just legless lizards, really, of sorts. They're a little bit different. There are legless lizards that aren't snakes also, which gets confusing. It all has to do with their skull and some other features. And then crocodiles and alligators, about 7,000 species of living reptiles. Here we go. Turtles are in the water. Tortoises are terrestrial. No teeth. Here's the tuatra. He's only found on islands near New Zealand, very rare. Has a parietal eye right on his forehead. Oops. Lizards and snakes. Actually more lizard species than snake species. And then crocodiles and alligators. There are actually only 2 species of alligator on Earth. So most of what we call alligators are mostly crocodiles. 25 different species of crocodile. Here's a better picture of the heart situation as we're moving into birds and mammals. Birds and mammals are much more active than any of the other groups, so they have a higher oxygen demand. They need a very efficient respiratory and circulatory system. Again, those go together. So if you look, birds and mammals completely divided left and right, so they can pump at very low pressure to the lungs and high pressure out to the body because of that division. So when your heart contracts, both sides contract at the same time. It's just a difference in wall thickness. And because of this division, there's no mixing of the oxygenated and unoxygenated blood. If you look at amphibians, you can see unoxygenated or low oxygen blood is blue and high oxygen blood is red. And you can see they mix. There's really not a clear division here. So they're pumping at the same pressure to the lungs as they are out to the body. And then the same for the fish. The fish are pumping at the same pressure to the gills as they are out to the body. So that was a big advancement in the birds. Birds, obviously very specialized for their food and their lifestyle. They have specialized feet, specialized beaks, specialized shape to their wings. So the big advancement in birds, or the big change, was flight. And birds really have a lot of reptile traits. Okay, they have an amniote egg. They have scales on their legs. And their feathers are actually modified scales. They're made of keratin. And there are intermediate fossils that show lizards starting to get little feathers and then more and more into full feathers. They don't have teeth, so they have a beak. Why do they not have teeth? Teeth are heavy, and if you're going to fly, you need to do things to reduce your weight. And I'm going to talk about those adaptations for flight in a second. So what are some other characteristics of birds? Obviously, they have adaptations for flight that we're going to talk about. They have wings, feathers, and some other things. They are the first endothermic animals, which means they have the ability to maintain a constant body temperature. Huge energy demand for that. They have to eat a lot. They have a high metabolic rate. In other words, they burn a lot of calories. Flight requires a lot of energy. Their whole vertebral column is modified for flight. They have air sacs in their bones, and their bones are hollow. They lay an amniote egg. They breathe with very efficient lungs. And again, their legs are covered in scales. Here are some of the adaptations for flight. There are more than this, but besides wings and feathers, they don't have a urinary bladder. Okay, so when a bird goes potty on your car or your head or whatever the case might be, that's really poop and really concentrated pee all together. Okay, they don't have a big bladder that stays full of liquid. That would be really heavy to fly around with. They've lost some bones. They have hollow bones. They have fused bones. No teeth. I don't know how that got scrunched in there. They have really efficient respiration and circulation, and I won't go into the details of that, but just know it's highly efficient, including the fact that they have air sacs in their bones. And they have a keel, just like a boat keel, on their sternum. And this is where those really strong flight muscles attach. When you eat a chicken breast, you are eating the flight muscles of that bird, even though they don't fly anymore. But if you really dissected out that chicken, you would see that sternum has a keel on it for increased surface area for attachment of flight muscles. Feathers are pretty amazing. They have these hooks and barbs that hold them together almost like Velcro. If you ever find a feather, walking around, hiking anywhere, pick it up and really run your hand along the feather this direction, and you'll have those barbs all separate from each other. And then if you run your hand the other direction, they all hook back together again like magical Velcro. And that's really what a bird is doing with its beak when it's preening its feathers. It's getting all those barbs back in place so it has that perfect airfoil surface for flying. You see, they're asymmetrical. Just like in the sharks, that asymmetrical shape is going to produce lift for the bird. This is the first known bird. Very reptile-like, had teeth, had a long reptilian tail, had feathers on his wings and tail. Most likely was what's called scansorial, which means he really climbed from branch to branch and lived up in the trees, but didn't actually soar or fly like the birds do today. Modern birds, lots of diversity there. Beautiful animals. Okay, and finally, we have the mammals. A lot of diversity in the mammals. If you think of this little shrew versus an elephant, crazy. The reason that mammals, the reason that mammals became successful was because of the extinction of the dinosaurs. So mammals were around at the same time as the dinosaurs, but they were little tiny nocturnal mammals. Didn't want to get eaten by dinosaurs. Dinosaurs could only be active during the day. Mammals were endothermic, but they couldn't be active during the day because that's when the big predators were there. Big predators got wiped out by an asteroid, and suddenly the mammals took off. And as you know, some of the mammals returned to the sea. That's how we have whales and seals and walruses and sea lions and dolphins. Crazy diversity of mammals. What do all mammals have in common? They all have hair at some point in their life. Their name comes from mammary glands that are used to feed their babies milk. That's a huge advantage if you can provide nourishment to your baby. You're going to increase the chances of that baby being surviving for the first year of life. Specialized teeth, depending on their diet. We have carnivore teeth, we have herbivore teeth, we have omnivore teeth. Mammals have oil and sweat glands. They have a very efficient 4-chambered heart. 3 bones in the middle ear, so really efficient hearing, especially in predators. Diaphragm really brings in a lot of oxygen. Single lower jawbone, don't worry about that one. You'd have to look at all the other skeletons to really get that one. And they're endothermic. Obviously, endothermy is not unique to mammals, though. Birds are also endothermic. Other notable features is that they have a high metabolic rate. Okay, so they have to have a really efficient heart and respiration. And that's because we keep our body temperature constant. There's a huge energy requirement for that. Most mammals have a placenta, but there are other types of reproduction in mammals that we'll talk about in a second. I want to show you the specialized teeth. So if you have an herbivore diet, you have these big, broad, grinding teeth. Okay, versus if you have a carnivore diet, you have these pointy meat shredding teeth. So you have really the best of both. Well, not really the best of both. We're like the jack of all, master of none. Our teeth are kind of intermediate. Okay, so we can't walk up to a zebra carcass and rip meat off the bone with our front teeth, but we can process the meat when we chew it. So omnivore teeth, carnivore teeth, herbivore teeth. Specialized teeth is unique to mammals. Reptiles have teeth, but they're all exactly the same all across their tooth row. 3 modes of reproduction. The monotremes lay eggs, leathery eggs, the echidna and the platypus. By the way, the safari park has 2 platypus now that you should go see. They're pretty cool. And there are 2 surviving species of echidna. So these are really primitive mammals. They still lay eggs. The next most primitive are the marsupials. So they give birth to a very, very tiny, tiny immature baby. It crawls into the pouch of the mom, it hooks itself to a nipple, and it continues to develop there. And then, of course, they keep trying to get back in mom's pouch long after they should be moving out of the pouch. That might sound familiar too. Possums, as we call them, but they're actually called opossums, are the only North American marsupial. Most of these crazy animals live in Australia. Okay, so the monotremes live in Australia, and most of these crazy marsupials live in Australia. Australia was like this ark of strange animals that broke away out into the ocean and took all the strange animals with it. Okay, and finally, the placental mammals. This is a pretty cool option. Your baby is fully developed when it's born. And in all but the primates, when these babies are born, they can get up and walk for the most part. And, you know, if you watch like a baby gazelle, obviously prey in Africa versus a predator, those little babies are born ready to run. They immediately go suckle from mom, and they can immediately walk and run if they need to. Well, not immediately, but within just a couple of hours of being born versus a couple of years for humans. I just wanted to quickly show you the diversity of mammals. You don't need to know any of these orders, but obviously a huge diversity if you think about bats, which can fly, primates, marine mammals. It's pretty crazy. So those are the chordates. Thank you.